IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today we're going to be talking about an issue that has been plaguing our minds since the very beginning of All Things Policy, namely the question of how on earth we are to regulate big tech. I have with me today Atish and Saurabh. Hi guys.
Hello.
Hi Anirudh.
Atish, Saurabh and I recently had a discussion about the question of a 0-year in education, and here we've all gathered again to once again discuss something that might be quite contentious. I'm sure a lot of you have seen on social media this hashtag or slogan almost to break up big tech. But what does that actually mean? And to be more precise, what do we really mean when we say big tech? Does a one-size-fits-all approach even apply when we think about breaking it up? How does antitrust and concepts like that work in a world where technology firms have such massive monopolies in some aspects of our lives? We're going to be diving into a lot of these questions over the next half an hour or so. Let me first just say that Atish has written an article about this. So if you'd like to better acquaint yourself with what we're going to be talking about, you should probably look at the link that you'll find in the description. And that said, over to you, Atish. Can you take us through your basic idea? What does the term big tech really mean? What does it imply?
Thank you, Anirudh. So yes, it might seem trivial at first as to why we need to go into the term big tech at all. And the reason why we have to do that is language is not an objective thing, right? So a language is not like neutral carrier of information like bunch of radio waves, for example. Instead, language is something that actually interacts with the information that it takes. Therefore, we need to understand the biases that go into the language that we use. And this insight was first articulated by this Swiss linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure, who is the father of modern linguistics, right? He made linguistics what it is today. As an example, if you take the terms terrorist, for example, or freedom fighter. Now, if you look at them objectively, or militant, for that matter, if you look at these terms objectively, what you find is that all of these are people that often use violent means for political purposes. And yet the terms have very different connotations for different kinds of people. The British famously called Bhagat Singh terrorist, but if we are to go and call Bhagat Singh a terrorist in streets, we would all be lynched, right? So that clearly shows that language is a very slippery thing, which is why the terms that we use carry certain biases that we must investigate in order to understand whether this term applies at all or not. So just like that.
Another great example of this terrorist freedom fighter thing is, I think, Rambo 3, if I remember correctly, had this nice thing just before the credits rolled, saying that the movie was dedicated to the brave freedom fighters of the Taliban who were fighting to liberate Afghanistan from the Soviets. And of course, it was the Taliban that just a few decades afterwards were designated as terrorists by the US. So it's very interesting. As long as they're on your side, the freedom fighters, as long as they're on the enemy side, they're terrorists. Saurabh, what do you think?
It's interesting to see where the origin of the word big tech comes from. And as in many cases, the numbers tell the story. So this follows from the tradition of labeling the big fours or the big fives of every industry. And these are the big fours or fives of the technology company. So they'll comprise of Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, and sometimes Microsoft in this mix, right? So, and the number that we're talking about is market capitalization. So what is the valuation of the company on NASDAQ tells us. And to give us an insight, in the start of year 2020, the combined valuation of the big tech was 4 trillion USD. Now, India's GDP, the total GDP in 2018, was about 2.7 trillion USD. So we're talking about the combined strength of all these companies being about twice the size of entire country's GDP.
Okay, so sort of this idea that market cap is what primarily defines a big tech firm seems like a fairly objective metric, right? But where does this idea that big tech as a term itself might come with other connotations really come in?
So I think there is a bit of baggage that comes with the word big in any economy. Right? I mean, we've seen the case of oil companies in the early start of the modern economy, and we keep seeing all of this. So the viewing angle that we're looking at is antitrust. Right? So there is an inherent harm, is what it is believed, when a company becomes big. The history to this is in 1890, we had an act called the Sherman Act, which came out in the US, named after its principal author, Senator John Sherman. And there are two sections that really define what this act says, Section 1 and Section 2 of the Sherman Act, where the idea is that you should not collude or come together to create a monopoly or a monopolization situation in the market and dominate, the key word being dominate the market, so that which is deterrent to other companies. And this story translated to the European Union, where the Article 101 and Article 102 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union takes up this idea and this understanding. So I'm guessing the baggage of the word big comes from the inherent understanding that something becoming big may also become dangerous and may capture and may become too difficult to control.
Yeah, exactly. When we use the term big, it makes us look at a company as something that needs to be regulated, and it makes us suspect that it is some kind of monopoly, and therefore there needs to be a government intervention that will put it in its place. And the problem in doing that with these big tech companies, right, these technology firms that have huge market capitalization, is the kind of problems that we are trying to solve through antitrust cannot ideally be solved through antitrust. For example, if you take Facebook, right? Now, the greatest complaint that we have against Facebook is that of information disorder and of data privacy, right? At least from a political point of view. We know how much controversy Facebook has gotten into given its data privacy goof-offs. And similarly with Facebook, we know the amount of harm it does on information disorder and how it allows all sorts of misinformation and disinformation campaigns to run without interfering with them. And if you look at that problem from a business perspective, from an antitrust perspective, it is not obvious as to whether these problems can be solved by breaking down Facebook, for example. Because the most important part in any technology product is that of network effects, right? And we know that people use Facebook not because it has a market capitalization of 3 billion or something like that, or like 500 billion, which is, I think, closer to the number. People use Facebook so much because their friends are on Facebook, right? And that network effect is very important to all sorts of technology products, because if you are a competitor, if you're a new firm trying to come up and challenge Facebook, you will have to build a base of users in order for more users to come in the first place. Because no one is going to join a new social networking site where there is no network at all. There is no social in that social network. Who are you going to network with if you don't have your friends in there? And by breaking Facebook down, you don't really enable competitors to do that, because the cost of the users leaving Facebook and going to another similar social networking site is high, because they would need their friends to do it first. And therefore, you have to incentivize users to change from Facebook to another social networking site if you want Facebook to break its monopoly. And that is not obvious that can happen through an antitrust regulation. Similarly, another problem by making such a term big tech is you exclude other technology firms that might be problematic. In India, for example, we all know that the largest cesspool of hate is actually not Facebook but Twitter. We see the amount of, following the death of Sushant Singh Rajput, for example, what happened on Twitter, which led to this disgusting cesspool of fake news and misinformation campaigns done against his ex-girlfriend, was just extremely violent, and it started in many ways on Twitter. And Twitter does not fall into the big tech category because it is not as big a company as Facebook is or any of the other tech firms are. And yet, when we want to solve the problem of Twitter, we need to also take Twitter into account if you want to solve misinformation and other problems. So it is a term that excludes other companies and makes people want to focus only on these 4 tech companies and looking at them as the problem, when the problem is not so much the companies themselves, but the technology that enables us to, the algorithms that enable us to discover content that we like and make filter bubbles and just push more extreme content. So that is one problem.
Okay, so if I understand this correctly, Atish, what you're saying is that when we say big tech, we ignore the fact that the reason why these companies work as well as they do is because they provide network effects. So there's a benefit to using Facebook as opposed to or there's a benefit to using Twitter as opposed to say a Mastodon, right? I remember that earlier on this year, if I'm right, there was this massive movement of people off Twitter and onto this open source social media platform called Mastodon, and it kind of worked for a month or two before like all of us lost interest because Twitter is just so much more engaging. But precisely because of the fact that Mastodon didn't offer a network effect and the fact that Twitter did, it just didn't make sense for Mastodon to really compete with Twitter in that sense.
Exactly.
But when we use the term big tech and we don't talk about Twitter and we don't talk about all these other potential products that also have network effects and therefore are anti-competitive. So, for example, Uber or, for example, Swiggy or any of these other like big food delivery apps, the kind of nuance that is needed, the fact that it's not the company itself, but the underlying technology itself that needs better regulation is kind of lost. Is that correct?
Exactly, precisely that, because we need to understand that there are technological effects that go beyond these companies. And by going after these companies, you're not really solving the problem at hand. But because even if you broke down Facebook, right, the competitor will not be able to take in, even if they have a lot of money, because of the network effects, because you have to persuade people to leave Facebook or Instagram and move somewhere else. And that does not help by breaking. You can't do that by breaking Facebook up. The second term is the tech part, right? This is big, then it's tech. And while it seems fair that these companies have big market capitalization, but what exactly ties them together, right? So if you look at a company like Facebook versus a company like Amazon, they are in a way very different. Facebook's revenue model is based on advertising mostly, right? While Amazon's is based on, Amazon is a platform that is a conduit between buyers and sellers. Their services are very different. Amazon actually provides you with, so if you order things on Amazon, you get a tangible product. On Facebook, the product you get is more of an experience of being with your friends and looking at content that you like. So what exactly ties them together is not obvious, except for the fact that they are all bound together by some sort of technology and millions of lines of code that we don't understand. But is that enough reason to put them all together in the same bucket? Because if you extend that argument, every company today has a website, right? Every company has some technological element to it, and yet we do not call them technology companies. So why is the term tech problematic? Because it makes us think that these are all similar kinds of companies, which is why you bunch them together. You wouldn't bunch companies together if you didn't think they were similar, right? That means that people would often think that the kind of regulation Apple needs is very similar to the kind of regulation Facebook would need. But that is not true, right? Because in Apple, one of the big problems that we face is that their App Store has this 30% commission rule, which is anti-competitive, right? So for every app to be on Apple, and you're making any in-app purchases, Apple takes 30% of the commission. And the only way you can get on iPhone is through the App Store, right? Mostly. So it is a very problematic notion, and that is a clear-cut example of what can be tackled by a heavy-handed regulation. But the problem with other kinds of companies, like YouTube's algorithm, which we know is very problematic, right? So many ISIS terrorists were trained on YouTube videos. How do you regulate that on an antitrust fold? You can't. And yet, because YouTube is under Google and Google is a big tech firm, you might think that they all pose similar kinds of problems and might require similar kinds of regulation. And that is why this term big tech has problems with both big and tech. It excludes other firms, and the word big makes us feel like it's a monopoly that needs to be regulated. And while that word tech bunches together these companies together that are very different from each other.
So there's a lot of interesting stuff to unpack here. The first is, as Saurabh was saying earlier in this conversation, big tech is just one of those snazzy sounding Silicon Valley-esque terms that was probably first picked up by journalists and kind of grew from there. I remember in 2012 or so, when I was entering college, that feels like such a long time ago now, there was almost like a cult of personality around a lot of these big tech CEOs, especially Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg. Everybody wanted to be them. But a few years now down the line, big tech has kind of morphed into something else, because there seems to be a growing realization across the world, and especially in the US, that you need to regulate them. But the people who want to regulate big tech are not necessarily the people who actually understand these firms and what they do very well. I'm sure a lot of our listeners, I'm sure both of you have also seen the fairly amusing testimonies that Sundar Pichai and Mark Zuckerberg et al. Have kind of faced from the US Senate and Congress. And it's kind of amusing to see just how little most legislators really understand about the way that these firms operate. So in that sense, Atish, pointing out that you need a different kind of approach. You need to look at the underlying technology itself and the way that that technology manifests on platforms to kind of gauge anti-competitive behavior is a much better way of going at it than just saying break up big tech, because there's a lot of nuance that's lost in. There's almost this unspoken fear of technology that seems to imply that, hey, if you don't get these guys under control, they're going to destroy society. But that doesn't have to be the case. With a better understanding of how this technology functions, which we do have, there's already a ton of research on how these platforms work and how they can be made to operate better. With a more nuanced regulatory perspective, it seems to me that they can certainly be brought into line, and kind of there are ways for society to scale back the risks that are posed by a lot of these platforms, while also unlocking the benefits. As to precisely what approaches various countries can take to actually do that, we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, Saurabh, do you have any thoughts?
I quite agree with everything you're saying. And I think catching up with the news, the way the government and regulators are thinking about technology companies is also evolving and changing. So when we look at regulation, always catches up with the market, right? It's very difficult to create a regulation before the market has evolved, and which would itself be a bad idea. So in the news is an information about how the UK is trying to set up a competition markets authority, where they have a digital markets unit under it, where they're trying to set up a different set of codes for how platforms and how tech companies will operate, what are the rules of the game they may or may not engage in, etc. So I think in that terms, India also has a fair share of evolution to go through on how to think about these technology companies and what they do. Just overall, the mainstream understanding of big tech, like you said, was there's something big, just break it up and it will just solve the problem, is definitely a wrong way to go about it. But there's a bigger problem also, right? So sometimes we believe that if something is big, it's a problem, right? If a particular company has a large market share and is playing a larger role in the economy, that's a problem. We should do something about it. So the antitrust regime does not allow us to do that, right? Being a monopoly itself, or being in the position of a monopoly itself, is not a crime. So if Google is big, does not mean that by the virtue of just being big, it's a bad thing and they should be broken down. But when it starts using its authority and its power in the market to change outcomes, to make things unfair, to indulge in unfair trade practices, is when we think of the rule of law perspective. Is that the right thing to do? And what can we do about it? And those are two different debates, right? So Google may expand in its size, but it's okay if it's not exploiting its power. In fact, some people may have a different answer to that question too. But just generally, we're seeing a trend across countries where Google and Apple and all the technology firms are coming under the radar, right? So the Department of Justice complaint is that Google is using its power and monopoly in the Android operating system market and exploiting data and information and search revenue that may come across from its browsing market, right? So this is a practice that is coming under the radar. This has also happened in the European Union, for instance. In India, we're seeing complaints put on Google that it's exploiting its position in the Play Store market, right? Paytm had a complaint how it was unfairly removed from the Play Store. And Play Store itself, a lot of people assume or believe is that it's a dominant position that Google has in this particular market of a platform for downloading apps. And in the recent case, Google Pay has come under the radar, where Competition Commission is investigating if it should see if there is an exploitation of its position that it's doing. So those are different problems that the regulators are looking at. So when we look at antitrust viewing lens, I quite agree with Atish that it's a different problem that we're trying to solve. And when it comes to the problem of privacy, it's a different thing that we are looking to solve. And the rule of law is different for different outcomes. However, it doesn't mean that we say that Amazon should be regulated differently or Apple should be regulated differently. The rule of law should be same and common for all companies, right? That's one leveler that we have the antitrust. That's how we think about antitrust, and that's how it has evolved to think. So it will be very interesting to see how regulators think about this. The Department of Justice complaint will have a lot of learning and principles that a lot of countries will use to see how they can be regulated. In fact, at times, even the companies themselves are on board to solve some of these problems. For instance, Facebook is coming across as big problem, right? Is it a media company? Is it a platform? If it's a platform, it has no business regulating speech, right? It cannot go and say that you may say this or may not say this. However, there are times where certain outrageous comments are made or certain fake news comes out, then it has to step in and think of itself as a media company. So it's a very different beast and a new problem that we haven't come across. And that's right, regulation has to catch up with it. And it'll be very interesting to see how it does.
Yeah, on that point, I wanted to clarify that I'm not saying these problems that I pointed out with Facebook or with the YouTube algorithm, right, that they're not somehow related to business. Of course they are, because the incentives for Facebook to push extreme content is based on its business model. Same with YouTube, right? But when regulating it, the reason why I said they need different kinds of regulation is because if you're going with the antitrust way to regulate, right, that's only one approach. If you go with that approach, then each one of them has to have a different kind of approach taken to them. Because as I pointed out with Apple, right, that might be more straightforward versus something like Facebook. Because the reason why Facebook is half an editorial company versus half a platform is because it can claim that it's a platform. In many ways it is. And yet the very fact that the algorithm chooses to show people something means that it makes an editorial choice. And that problem, when you want to solve that problem, that has to be solved in a very different manner than saying, for example, Apple to reduce its commission rate on its App Store. And therefore, what I think is how we must look at it is not how the United States has, which is through regulation and antitrust, but through data privacy. Right. So one of the ways in which it can actually work is, again, an example that comes from Apple. Now, we know that iPhones are one of the most secure devices on planet Earth, right? And Apple has some very good regulations as to what apps it allows and what security measures they must follow. And I think that should be incentivized across the board for all of these companies. And therefore, countries, instead of focusing on breaking these big tech companies down, should instead focus on data privacy laws that are strict, that have actual frameworks that allow private data to not be exploited by these companies in the way that they are. Because if you look at every other sector, right, consumer protection is pretty strong. There is very little that say, like we all do online payments through our credit cards. And those are much more secure than browsing the internet currently. So it seems rather unfair that this is one place that does not have any consumer protection regulation. Instead, we are looking at how to increase more competition. But the problem is, by increasing competition, you're not actually helping the problem of data privacy, which seems to me to be the underlying problem that governs all of these companies, which are running on an algorithm that exploits the data in order to increase their market capitalization. So for that to happen, we need to look beyond this antitrust framework and go towards a legal framework of data protection.
So there's some interesting points there, Atish, and I partially agree with you. I don't think that the primary issue is necessarily just to do with data privacy. I absolutely agree that consumer protection really needs to be a thing on social media, for the simple reason that people, because they don't pay subscription fees necessarily to any of these companies, don't seem to realize that they're actually services. And as you said earlier, there's services which have a very, very wide variety of functions. The editorial function of actually deciding what content you're going to consume is perhaps arguably the most important one. There should be an ability for me to say that, hey, Facebook is only feeding me this particular kind of content and not the stuff that I am actually signing up for, and therefore I deserve protection. But how exactly consumers are going to make that case is, I think, a little harder to kind of figure out. Because are you suggesting that regulators should be given access to these algorithms so they can actually see how they function, and therefore try to nudge these companies into a more equitable way of making them work? I don't really think that's realistic. So to summarize, what I'm trying to ask you, Atish, is how exactly can consumer protection be made the first step? How exactly do you figure that data protection is really the departure point for this? Because I can say that there's actually a lot more going on, right? So one aspect of it is definitely the fact that you're signing away all sorts of like absolutely insane things to Facebook in terms of how they can track you and so on. But even if you have a much more limited set of things, even if you're just giving them information as to what pages you're liking on their platform, there are still ways for them to kind of manipulate the media ecosystem that you're going to be engaged, that you're going to be exposed to. So unless you can actually quantify to what extent your behavior is being influenced because of the decisions of a particular platform, how do you make consumer protection the first step in how these, like Facebook, for example, can be regulated?
Yeah, so what I was thinking is, the reason why I said data protection is the underlying issue is that is the business model driving all of these companies, right? In more or less, because they monetize personal data. So Amazon does it by providing recommendations based on what you would want to buy, while Facebook does that on what content you would want to consume. Similarly with YouTube.
Yeah.
The problem is to what extent these algorithms should filter and make editorial decisions as to what you need to see. So for that, you need to decide how much personal data is allowed to be taken. And of course, we need to understand that we cannot go back to a world where you cannot trade your personal data anymore, right? So the regulatory framework of data protection that comes in will have to take into the account that personal data will have to be given away, because this is the new business model. You can't roll that back, right? But there are ways in which...
And more importantly, can you take away data that these companies have already collected? Let's say that tomorrow the entire regulatory, let's say that tomorrow morning all regulators all across the world wake up and say, hey, Facebook, you can't collect these kinds of data on all your users anymore. And Facebook says, okay, but you already have so much information on how these people behave. They already have such a good understanding of how people act on their platforms. So you probably first have to retrospectively also change the kind of data that these companies have collected. But again, Atish, I mean, I don't think that restricting the types of data that they can collect is really going to achieve that much. If you guys are able to hear Rooster in the background, please excuse me. But yeah, the basic point I'm trying to make is that I don't feel like data privacy is really the only thing that's going to happen, is the only thing that's going to really fix the problem. I kind of feel like, as you said, one of the primary reasons why these companies work so well is because they're able to collect information and deliver recommendations to users. And while a lot of users might prefer a more kind of neutral recommendation algorithm for their content or what they're shopping for, a lot of others don't. A lot of people genuinely appreciate the fact that Facebook helps them connect to people who share common interests, anti-vaxxers, for example, or QAnon folks. I'm pretty sure see Facebook as their sole resource for fighting against the tyranny of liberal conspiracies. So I am not sure that data protection itself is going to solve it, because as you were saying earlier, when there's an editorial choice, you need to bring in some aspects of older media regulations onto some of these platforms, is my point of view. Saurabh, what do you think?
I think you're right. There's no silver bullet. So We can't solve for one problem and have other problems get solved on their own. Right? The best way to think about this is that, like every other organization, a tech company or a platform is a bundle of things it does. Right? There are many activities that it takes place, and every activity has its own regulation and own rule of law parameters that are put on it, and do's and don'ts are figured out from there. So, for one instance, if we think of Uber, right, as a platform, we see that there are a lot of labor law issues also related to them. Swiggy again does something like that, right? So there are a lot of people. So in that facet, the labor laws are equally as important as privacy laws are important, or as data protection is, or as antitrust measures are. So like any other company, these companies are a bundle of things, and they give you a bundle of services. And the complexity is increased because now they're not just a seller and a buyer kind of transaction, except they are marketplaces, right? These are platforms. So there are more things at play. However, there is one universal mechanism, right, which is throughout time, which has worked. There are debates about this, if it works or does not work, which is the our old friend competition, right? Market forces. So when we look at organizations like big tech and how their positions are becoming dominant, one important question we must answer is, why is it that they are dominant? Why is it? What is the entry barrier? Why is it that tomorrow a small company can come up and change how we look at algorithms, redesign algorithms, take a fresh approach to things, and make a name for themselves in that market? So once we start answering those questions, once we start unpacking those questions, we have answers, right? So for instance, privacy is a problem across web browsers, and that gives us way to a DuckDuckGo. Right? A DuckDuckGo comes in. The sole premise of DuckDuckGo is that, look, we're not going to harass your data. Your privacy is yours, and this is how we work, and this is our value system, which is different from other companies. Hence, you should come to us. That's a market reaction to some of these problems. And the question is, in time, how will markets evolve? Will some companies which we don't see today come up and solve some of these answers? It's not just the government that is looking to solve these questions. A lot of private agencies, private individuals, and entrepreneurs are also looking to find answers to these problems. So again, there is no silver bullet, and these are a bundle of activities that they do, and every activity will have a different viewing lens of how we go about doing it, and how we examine what is wrong and what is right. And in the long run, maybe we'll have a different outcome than we did. Right? Nobody imagined Google becoming a thing back when Microsoft was dominant. Like, Google was not something anybody cared about. And today, Microsoft is not so much in the discussion as Google is. Maybe tomorrow, some other company would be. So these problems keep evolving, and we cannot have one solution which fits all. And we'll find out, right, how things go and how our rule of law adapts with these companies.
This discussion helps me rethink what I wrote, because my thought has evolved, and it's been a week since I wrote it, and in this time my thought about this has evolved in many ways. And yes, competition does seem a good solution to all of these problems, but as I pointed out in the beginning, the problem with competition is that tech is very different from other industries in the fact that it has network effects the way it does, right? So how many people will be persuaded to go to DuckDuckGo instead of Google? Right? Or how many people even use Mozilla instead of Google Chrome, right? These end up becoming individual choices, because yes, you can make a company out of it, but how do you monetize it, right? How much is DuckDuckGo's revenue? How much is Signal's revenue, which famously was the great alternative to WhatsApp, and which is very secure, which helped make the entire umbrella revolution in Hong Kong possible. So, but how will these businesses survive? So you have to drive economic incentives towards them, right? So do you do something more like taxing these companies a lot? But that does not seem a very good solution either, right? So taxing big tech companies a lot, therefore, so that investors invest more on these other better alternatives that protect your data and are not as problematic. Do you do that? Or instead, to me, what seems more obvious is, again, sorry for harping about Apple, but the way Apple has become a big company and then also made sure that it does not have to be exploiting your data at every step in order to remain that big company seems to be a good way. Maybe there are lessons to be learned from Apple's business model and how Apple has made it very secure on your iPhone to surf the internet and to do whatever you want to do, to get all the conveniences of technology without facing the risks that these other companies expose you to. But that solution might not really fit into Facebook, right? Because while you might find a solution to a search browser like DuckDuckGo, or Apple as a solution, as an alternative to Android, is very good. But how do you make a social networking site without network effects? Or how do you make a social networking site that does not depend on your data and does not show you things depending on what you have been previously watching in order to make its money, right? So which is why I don't really understand whether or not competition can be a solution to all of the issues. It might be to some of them. Similarly, which is why I think data protection could be a solution to others, like Facebook, especially. Like when Facebook gives you recommendations for groups, for example, Facebook has to understand that it's an editorial company. That's the first step, right? So the first step of regulation must be to tell Facebook that you are no different than news website or something like that makes editorial choices to publish certain content, which will then incentivize them to not allow certain kinds of things to be published. But that also brings in problems of bias. So because Silicon Valley is much more liberal than the rest of the world, it's likely that conservative opinions will be censored. So there is a whole quagmire of issues that we need to understand, and which is why on the larger principle that Saurabh expressed, that there cannot be a silver bullet solution, is what I took away from this. And yes, that still ties up to the fact that using big tech and looking at these companies as homogeneous entities that are really big and need to be broken down, this does not help. Because, on a final point, if you do break down Facebook, for example, then what does that do? Counterintuitively, what it does is it actually allows Facebook to take your data even more. It will incentivize to take your data more because now they're a smaller company, and now they would be more desperate for advertisers, and they would be more willing to bow down to their demands of more and more data being stolen from you. So in a way, what you try to solve, you're actually exaggerating by bringing in antitrust solution. So yes, I think we need to rethink different ways in which we can regulate these companies, because this is a solution. This is a problem that has not been presented to humanity ever. It's entirely novel. Business models are entirely novel. And we just need to go beyond thinking, in conventional ways.
Fascinating. So once again, we have managed to dissect a problem at great length and propose some kind of solutions. I hope that all of you, our listeners, found it instructive in some ways and kind of understood the complexity that goes into the idea of regulating the firms that have become such an integral part of our social media and consumption landscapes. So once again, you should definitely check out Atish's op-ed in Deccan Herald. You will find a link to it in the description. Thank you both, Atish and Saurabh, for joining me, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Another fun week in the books last week, and I think you guys should definitely check out some of the shows that we did. So first, let me tell you about Cock and Bull. We did 2 Cock and Bulls on Cyrus Says last week, which is, I don't think we've ever done before. But there was just so much to talk about, and it was fun. The first one was just on Trish, myself, and Cyrus. The second one, we had Abhijit Ganguly on, and that was a great episode. Do check that out. Check out Know Your Kanun as well. It's been a while since I spoke about that show, but Umber's been doing a great job on it. This week he spoke to Naina Sharma, a Canadian lawyer, about the ways that you do business in Canada and the challenges that presents. Definitely very interesting stuff. Do check that out. The guys at Naan Curry are doing some really, really fun stuff. Do check out their latest episode. They talk about roti, the simple bread, but it's got some complications to it. Let them tell you about what they are. Do check that out. Also, do definitely check out The Wire Talks with Siddharth Bhatia. He's been killing it, man. It's just a new show, but what great conversations. This week, he had Siddharth Singh on to talk about pollution. Do check that out. And you know what, guys? The best news of all, Simplified is back. They've been back for a few weeks and I haven't called them out before, but remember that they're back and do check them out. This week, they talk about, does censorship make sense? Knowing the guys, I think I know the answer to that, but you should go check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.